They will never be able to get a cultured pearl that an expert like me can't tell with half an eye." He pointed to a chain that Mrs. Ramsay wore. "You take my word for it, Mrs. Ramsay. That chain you are wearing will never be worth a cent less than it is now." Mrs. Ramsay, in her modest way, flushed a little and slipped the chain inside her dress. Ramsay leaned forward. He gave us all a look, and a smile flickered in his eyes. "That's a pretty chain of Mrs. Ramsay's, isn't it?" "I noticed it at once," answered Mr. Collada. "Gee," I said to myself, "those are pearls, all right." "I didn't buy it myself, of course. I'd be interested to know how much you think it cost." "Oh, in the trade, somewhere around $15,000. But if it was bought on Fifth Avenue, I shouldn't be surprised to hear that anything up to $30,000 was paid for it." Ramsay smiled grimly. "You'll be surprised to hear that Mrs. Ramsay bought that string at a department store the day before we left New York, for $18. Mr. Collada flushed. "Rot! It's not only real, but it's as fine a string for its size as I've ever seen." "Will you bet on it? And I'll bet you $100 it's imitation." "Done!"
"Oh, Elmer, you can't bet on a certainty,"
said Mrs. Ramsay. She had a little smile on her lips, and her tone was gently deprecating. "Can't I? If I get a chance of easy money like that, I should be all sorts of a fool not to take it."
"But how can it be proved?"
she continued.
"It's only my word against Mr. Collada's."
"Let me look at the chain, and if it's imitation, I'll tell you quickly enough. I can afford to lose $100, said Mr. Collada. "Take it off, dear. Let the gentleman look at it as much as he wants." Mrs. Ramsay hesitated a moment. She put her hands to the clasp.
"I can't undo it," she said. "Mr. Collada will just have to take my word for it."
I had a sudden suspicion that something unfortunate was about to occur, but I could think of nothing to say. Ramsay jumped up. "I'll do it." He handed the chain to Mr. Collada. The Levantine took a magnifying glass from his pocket and closely examined it. A smile of triumph spread over his smooth and swarthy face. He handed back the chain. He was about to speak. Suddenly, he caught sight of Mrs. Ramsay's face. It was so white that she looked as though she were about to faint. She was staring at him with wide and terrified eyes. They held a desperate appeal. It was so clear that I wondered why her husband did not see it. Mr. Collada stopped with his mouth open. He flushed deeply. You could almost see the effort he was making over himself. "I was mistaken," he said. "It's a very good imitation, but, of course, as soon as I looked through my glass, I saw that it wasn't real. I think $18 is just about as much as the damn thing's worth." He took out his pocketbook, and from it $100 note. He handed it to Ramsay without a word. "Perhaps that'll teach you not to be so cocksure another time, my young friend," said Ramsay as he took the note. I noticed that Mr. Collada's hands were trembling. The story spread over the ship, as stories do, and he had to put up with a good deal of chaff that evening. It was a fine joke that Mr. Noel had been caught out. But Mrs. Ramsay retired to her stateroom with a headache. Next morning, I got up and began to shave. Mr. Collada lay on his bed smoking a cigarette. Suddenly there was a small scraping sound, and I saw a letter pushed under the door. I opened the door and looked out. There was nobody there. I picked up the letter and saw that it was addressed to Max Collada. The name was written in block letters. I handed it to him. "Who is this from?" He opened it. "Oh." He took out of the envelope, not a letter, but $100 note. He looked at me, and again he flushed. He tore the envelope into little bits and gave them to me. "Do you mind just throwing them out of the porthole?" I did as he asked, and then I looked at him with a smile. "No one likes being made to look a perfect damned fool," he said. "Were the pearls real?" I asked.
"If I had a pretty little wife, I shouldn't let her spend a year in New York while I stayed at Kobe,"
said he. At that moment, I did not entirely dislike Mr. Collada. He reached out for his pocketbook and carefully put in it the $100 note.